Hello and welcome to the second of these sort of three additional sessions where we're discussing the current mitigation arrangements that involve centre assessments and estimated grades to be put forward for maths and English. As we've said, we'll be here every Wednesday this month, including the sort of next. So it's a bit of an extra chance to kind of check in with us on this whole process. You've got with you today, so quick hello from Amanda.
Hello everybody. Hope you're all keeping safe and well.
Is run through some of the many questions that we've already had asked and try and sort of address some of those where we can. Again, we're going to make functional skills the main focus of this, as there have been quite a significant change to the position for those in the last few days as far as exceptional arrangements are concerned. Quick note about the questions into themes, and we're going to go through some of the more slides jumping ahead. What we did say also last week was that it was likely people would have more questions as they start to engage more fully in this process. So we will be inviting you a bit later on in this session to post any further questions if they haven't already been addressed. So if you've got burning questions, hold those thoughts for a moment, and we will ask you to sort of put those. But do also have a look, if you haven't already done so, at the quite substantial FAQs document that we've put up on the COVID-19 pages. So I mean, in often quite a few cases you may well find, and I'll to reiterate that we have sort of various questions that have come to us firstly through this, but also through other channels in recent days, and we are sort of in the process literally of questions and answers to those. Probably worth saying, as always, there is the standard Maths and English resource hub for details about obviously our regular Maths and English updates. So obviously stuff that's not necessarily COVID-19 specific is the place to go to for those. So moving on, I think we will emphasise stuff. If you go to the Sitting Guilds COVID-19 page, sittingguilds.com/COVID-19, you'll find an overview of the mitigation arrangements as a whole, and within that there's a section specifically covering functional skills. There's also a section specifically covering ESOL. You'll also see, if you're outside England, a separate Scotland, Northern Ireland and Wales section that contains information about the arrangements for essential skills in both Northern Ireland and in Wales. We did do an extra couple of sessions last week for centres delivering each of these, and there will be separate FAQs documents landing for those as well in the coming days, as well as recorded presentations. And finally, there's a general set of guidance covering the arrangements for what we term vocationally related qualifications, or VRQs. This is where you would go to find information about the mitigation arrangements for things like, for example, mathematics skills and English skills bite-sized qualifications, as well as for employability, which does lead me to mention quite a key piece of breaking news. Not quite where we've got the kind of flashing up. Probably worth saying, if you have noticed, you may have received an email the last day or so noting that we have announced literally towards the end of yesterday that candidates registered for the mathematics skills, English skills 3847 bite-sized suite of qualification, and also the employability suite, and also principles of maths English. I think there are a couple of other qualifications that are in this same kind of box as well, that are now also going to be eligible to, or will be covered by the calculated result process. Also going to be obviously covered through. The information was kind of wrapped up in a broader email about the process for VRQ, so I appreciate not everyone will have seen this yet, and it is new news. The guidance document covering those went up on the VRQs page literally this morning, so it is very much hot off the press, and I know we will be doing some further sort of walking through kind of the process for those in the coming days. But just to say, obviously they are now also in scope as far as being able to have kind of calculated or centre assessment grades put forward. The process itself, as far as those qualifications are concerned, broadly follows that for other VRQs. So it is the standard guidance that you kind of need to look for first. But I guess I appreciate there will be some specific questions that start to emerge from that around units learners might have done or not done, and so forth. And we will seek to answer those in the coming days. Moving on again, just to remind and reiterate about the sort of various documents that resources that you'll need to refer to, specifically in the case of functional skills, but also there are kind of similar documents for other qualifications as well. So there is a sort of a guidance document, a recorded presentation that sort of takes you through that step-by-step process, a kind of a single step-by-step guide that we'll just put up in a second to sort of remind you. In the case of functional skills, there is also something called the past descriptors, which has kind of adds to that as well as an FAQs document which we mentioned, and obviously there'll be an expanded version of that kind of arriving shortly. And then finally, for functional skills, we also produced a model letter to learners kind of that you could use to kind of help explain the process to them. So those documents are all on that COVID-19 microsite under functional skills.
Paul, can I just interrupt say that we've been updating the FAQs for functional skills and are hoping to get those up on the website. The other thing that we're being asked about are the past descriptors for ICT, which also we hope to be able to publish on the website either today or tomorrow.
Yes, that's helpful just to add that particularly. The ICT one, I know I saw a version of those circulating this morning, so I know they're very close to being ready. And obviously the FAQs that, as we said, we've been kind of working on adding to those in the last few days. So yeah, I guess the message is they'll be up there as soon as we possibly can get them up. Just to reiterate on the 6-step guide, functional skills, like most qualifications, basically the process has kind of 6 broad stages that kind of underpin it, and you can see obviously the summary guide here that sort of takes you through that sort of process step by step. The recorded presentation similarly kind of runs you through those step by step in terms of what's needed in each case. So that sort of probably sets the scene. What I was going to do now was sort of dive into one of the sort of hot topic areas, and that was particularly around evidence and evidence requirements. I think what we've got here are 6 things that kind of paraphrase or they summarize some of the various questions that we've had around that whole arena. And I think the first thing to say here, and I think it possibly gets a little bit locked in perhaps got a little bit lost in translation, is that when we're asking you to gather evidence, it's really about backing up and validating your professional judgments. And we appreciate, I think evidence is going to take lots of forms. It's going to sometimes be determined by what you can actually realistically access. It's a case of what's there, and there are different forms of evidence that can have a different role. So I was going to sort of throw over to Amanda now and say, kind of, let's have a look at that first question, particularly around physical evidence.
Oh, sorry, I'd muted myself because my neighbour's chosen to mow the lawn at this precise moment in time. Yes. So one of the questions we had was around how centres retain physical evidence and how they might send that to us. So, Paul, I think what we're saying here is a very definite instruction that centres will not be required to submit any physical evidence to us. This is right, is it?
It is, and I think it is about, I guess, and this is not obviously just unique to functional skills, it's about the whole centre assessment grade process as a whole. What we're asking in terms of, and we can get into the mechanics of the actual submission process a bit later on, but basically what we're asking centres to do is to obviously submit an outcome for each learner, and to do that via the walled garden, to complete a declaration form that's obviously signed off by the head of centre, so it has to be obviously signed off by somebody in authority, but then of the evidence that they're using to underpin those discussions. So the declaration form asks for the forms of evidence that have been considered to be listed. It doesn't ask, and we need to be very clear about this, we're not asking you to physically send anything to us other than the completed form and obviously the walled garden submissions. The other stuff that basically you hang on to, we may ask to see that, so we do ask you to keep that potentially for up to 6 months, but basically it's what you hold to underpin your judgments, which kind of leads a little bit into that second question about, does evidence need to be physically to hand when we make our judgments? And that's kind of come about quite a lot, because I think people have seen, have kind of seized a little bit on the point about, well, what if everything's locked in the staff room and we can't get access to it at the moment? And also what's emerged quite a lot as a question in the last few days, which was about have we've got sample tests that learners did a few months back. We've got records of the outcome of those, but we haven't actually physically got the test itself. Is that okay? And I guess probably the standard answer to all of those things is it's records that you can access that may not be in physical form, but it can be things that you are there to validate your decision or to validate your judgments. Anything to add to that, do you think, Amanda?
No, I think you've explained that. I think there has been some confusion about the purpose of the evidence. The evidence is designed for teachers, to support teachers in making a professional judgment about whether that learner would have passed or failed. Now, the evidence, it might be physical paper or it might be electronic evidence. How centres keep that is going to be entirely up to them. I was talking to a centre yesterday who said that actually what they're doing is keeping a record alongside each learner's name of where the evidence is stored, so what type of evidence it is and where you will be able to find it, rather than trying to claw everything into a physical folder with that learner's name on.
Yeah, and remember, with all of that, you're not actually being asked to send anything physically to us. So it is about you knowing it's there and you being able to, if we came back to you and said kind of, where is this, that you've got an answer to that in essence. So, and we appreciate, obviously, in many cases, people haven't got physical access to premises at the moment necessarily, or they won't always have. And that's obviously understandable as well.
The next question is around when the evidence came from. Centres are asking whether they can refer to evidence that was developed since lockdown happened. So we have a bit of an answer for this one, don't we, Paul?
We have. I mean, it's a little bit of a kind of, and I guess it's trying to sort of think back a little bit to the actual purpose of this process, which was what it was trying to do was mitigate for the fact that any normal learning that would have happened between the 20th of March and the end of July, it's trying to sort of almost play what if lockdown hadn't happened, what was the outcome that you would have had. So, and we appreciate, obviously, in some cases people will have access to literally nothing that's been done since the 20th of March. So the guidance is framed around an assumption that you wouldn't have access to anything after the 20th of March. Now, in many cases, people will have things that they can usefully look at and draw upon, but at the same token, and that's, to be clear, that's absolutely fine. But equally, if you've got stuff from before then, there is a kind of assumption that face-to-face evidence gathered in a face-to-face environment is more valid than evidence gathered since lockdown when you've only had virtual access. But again, that's a kind of very broad assumption. It's not an absolute finite. I guess there may well be things that are actually quite robust that you can draw upon. Another thing I've seen crop up, actually particularly more in the context of ESOL than necessarily functional skills, but I guess the same principle applies, is that there may well be learners who have only been on programme since lockdown, and that you may literally have nothing that was developed before then. And again, I think the answer in broad terms is that that's absolutely fine to draw upon those and use those.
I'm aware that we leapfrogged a question, and that was partly
we did
because
actually the sample, yeah.
Yes, that was partly because the two sometimes go hand in hand, because a lot of the formative work that's been, or teaching and learning that's been happening since lockdown, has often taken the form of completing sample papers. So can centres use those? Is that sufficient evidence? And I think it's worth saying that it's about being confident that what the evidence that you're considering is valid. So did that learner actually complete that paper? Are you confident that it was the learner who has actually come up with those responses? But certainly sample assessments do support your understanding about whether the learner would have passed or not.
Yeah. And that kind of, I guess, question 5 on this slide sort of kind of follows on a little bit from that, in the sense of that notion of I have a marked book with scores from formative assessment and sample papers. Is that sufficient? And again, it's a similar point, I suppose.
Yes, I mean, as a teacher, I kept a record for each learner about the sort of activities they did and the marks they scored, and I did that for sample papers and also anything I might have set them in class. So that is the sort of evidence that paints a picture about the ability of the learner, and it will certainly support you in making that judgment. There is a more challenging question about not having evidence to base a decision on. Having evidence is actually, it was a requirement. So during the process of deciding how to move forward with centre assessed grades, in talks with Ofqual and the Department for Education and also the other awarding bodies, it was very much a pillar of this process that these decisions would be made on the basis of evidence that could be reviewed by teachers. So if you have no evidence, is that because they were on another program and that actually that the work that they did with another teacher on a different part of their program might support you making a judgment? But where there is no evidence, it may be that you cannot make submit a centre assessed grade at this time, and that those learners will need to be managed outside of the centre assessed grades process. Paul, is there anything you'd like to add to that?
I think, I mean, I guess it's trying to sort of think about that notion of evidence, in the sense that there isn't one right answer to what is appropriate evidence. There are lots of things that you can potentially look to, and really it's about having something tangible. I know one of the things that's cropped up quite a lot in some discussions is about where you have evidence that's not necessarily a physical product, but is clearly an understanding or an insight that you've gained through contact with learners, and those things are all evidence. So in that sense, it's things that you can point to inform your judgment. If you are literally in a situation where you have literally nothing on which to base a decision, then I guess that can fall into the category of a learner not being able to make a reliable judgment, and that may well be the situations where you may need to say, look, actually, there isn't enough for me to make a decision over which I can stand over and have confidence in, and that may well in those situations mean that they can't go forward as far as this process is concerned. I think we need to be clear that isn't a fail. That's just simply that they're not in scope as far as this process is concerned. A fail has quite clear connotations here, in the sense that that's about a learner having reviewed the evidence you've got, you've made a judgment that they wouldn't have been successful in the assessment had they done so. And I think it's quite important to be clear about the difference between the two here, in the sense of not in scope is not the same as I've reviewed that and I've made a judgment that they wouldn't have passed.
Yes, actually, somebody's just made a comment in the question box, which you might like to comment on, Paul. So Leanne has said, isn't the crux of this that if an EQA from an awarding organisation was to visit you, could you justify the submission you made? So this is the purpose of the evidence. It's supporting that submission.
Yeah, I think that's quite a good point, actually, and it is. I mean, I think we said at the beginning, this in the end, this comes down to professional judgment, and it comes down to, can you hand on heart stand over that decision, whether it's a yes, they would have passed, or it's a no, they wouldn't have passed, and appreciate that's always going to be. It is a. I mean, in some ways, the whole thing is predicated around what if. So it is to some extent a making the best judgment you can in the circumstances. But yeah, can you justify your decision, and not just to your EQA? Can you, given that your head of centre or somebody in authority within the centre has got to sign off this, can you justify it to them as well? But ultimately, yes, if the EQA were to pose the question to you subsequently, can you justify the pass or indeed the failed decision that you've made?
So I think probably what we ought to do here is, because we've answered some points regarding evidence. If there is a question regarding evidence that you feel that we haven't responded to, can I ask you to type that question in the question box? Because what we're doing then is being able to take those questions away and add them to the knowledge that we're sharing.
That's brilliant. What we'll now do, though, is move on to another sort of hot topic area. And again, it's about obviously trying to sort of paraphrase quite a whole myriad of questions that we've had around the whole topic of speaking, listening, and communicating. And I guess to some extent it leads on a little bit from the previous topic in that it is about how can we evidence this. And I guess the thing that separates speaking, listening, particularly from say, for example, writing, is there isn't often physical product evidence that you can point to and say, look, there's a piece of writing, it was clearly reflecting level 1 or level 2, I can use that to inform my judgment. Speaking, listening, you've got a whole range of things. So we've got a number of questions here that highlight some of those points. Amanda, I don't know if there's any particular thoughts that you had initially on any of these.
This was a bit of a challenge because we've tried not to be very prescriptive about what evidence would look like, because the minute you come up with a list of things, people try and shoehorn their concepts into those things. So what we really wanted people to do was to think about how they make judgments about learners' abilities, and then how could they apply that to the speaking and listening and communicating assessment criteria. I mean, I think, the big question is, what kind of evidence can we use for making these judgments? So you will have interacted with your learners and communicated with your learners in a number of different ways that are not necessarily the set assessment activities that you would normally conduct, but they're very often useful for making those decisions. So, tutorial discussions are quite a formal situation where you have a formal discussion with people, and that would allow you to make a judgment about whether the learner would be able to meet the assessment criteria in the normal course of events. And I think, it's probably worth just writing a little, maybe a witness statement in some way about that learner, and examples of when you might have contributed into a conversation, what sort of activities you might have done with that learner, teaching and learning through various virtual platforms, and how could you then draw evidence from that Sorry, I think I'm burbling there, Paul.
No, and I think there's some things there in the sense of, yeah, there isn't one right answer. I think that idea of producing a witness statement or a testimony of some sort, to, again, that is a form of evidence in the sense that it's a justification for your decision, and in some ways in the sense that it's documenting your insights and the basis on which you've made a judgment that they've met the criteria. There are a couple of specific things also in these questions that's probably worth highlighting. One was question 2, which was about, well, the only thing I've got to draw upon is a one-to-one discussion, and obviously for the qualification, assuming we're talking about higher than entry 1, then they will have had to have taken part in group discussions. And I guess the best way of answering that is to say that this is about obviously trying to again pose that what if question, in the sense of you're trying to think about where the learner would have got to during that March to July period. Would they have, in normal circumstances, have had the opportunity to take part in group discussions? Can you, as far as it's reasonable to assume, can you make a judgment that they would have been able to do that successfully? And again, it's about obviously using that. Obviously, if you've got one-to-one discussions, they will give you some insights as to the learner's capabilities. But again, it's about building up that picture of things on which you can make that overall judgment. We've got another thing that I guess also has come up a little bit, which is, what about if we went ahead and did the actual assessments remotely in the meantime and used that as evidence?
Yes, I mean, in many ways that's an ideal opportunity to draw a conclusion about the learner's performance. At the moment, we're not accepting claims on walled garden for specific components, because the centre assessed grades is the direction of travel. So that I can see lots of questions coming in the question box about when will they be able to book tests again. So on the website we've published a comment saying that live exams and assessments will become available from the 1st of August, and in the same way live speaking, listening, communicating activities could take place from that point onwards. So in the meantime, any activities that you've carried out will just support your judgment in submitting a centre assessed grade. So Paul, I can see there's a question there about using observation from work-based units. So I think it's quite valuable to do that, isn't it? What do you think?
Absolutely. I mean, I think what we're trying, or what's at the heart of this, I guess, is using anything that you can reasonably draw upon to inform your judgments, and actually. I mean, I think we touched on this a little bit last week, actually, but it's probably worth reiterating that particularly with functional skills, that often, in most cases, learners are doing functional skills alongside other things, and they may well, in the course of their vocational program, their other learning, be taking part in discussions. If those insights can be brought into play, absolutely, use that to inform your judgments. If you've got examples of when the learner interacted with customers, and you've got that to kind of highlight, then those are all things. They're all things that kind of build up that broader picture of and that picture of which you can kind of in the end make a yes/no decision.
Yes, I mean, I'm seeing questions saying, do people have to complete the speaking, listening and communicating paperwork? I think that the set paper, the assessor records, we're not looking for those to be completed, but I think it's important to probably draw your thoughts together in one place. And I certainly talked to a customer recently who said they were going to take the assessor records and use that as a basis for making their judgments. They were going to get rid of some of the boxes but just have like a bullet point list of the types of activities those learners took part in, and then making some having the assessment criteria in front of them will assist them to make a judgment about whether that learner would have passed in the normal normal events. And
I mean,
sorry, go on.
Sorry, I was going to say it's perhaps apt to say that actually informing all of this should still be the subject content statements for functional skills at the level that you're making an assessment judgment about. So you should, in all of this, your judgment should be informed by the level 1 or the level 2 speaking, listening and communicating subject content statements, in a sense of helping you tune into what are the requirements at that level, what are the expectations. We're not looking for 100% coverage in the same because this process is about trying to surmise assuming normal circumstances and whether all of those criteria would have been met if they'd gone ahead and done the actual discussion, but it should be informing your judgments in all cases. And similarly, in the case of reading and writing, you've got the past descriptors to help inform that notion of minimal competence and to help you kind of make that judgment about sufficiency.
And it's probably worth saying that English is 3 separate components, so they can all be claimed for separately. It might be that you were confident about your learner's ability to do speaking and listening, but not confident about their reading. And what you'll do is make decisions at a component level rather than for the whole qualification.
And there's another aspect to that as well, in the sense that almost before you get to that point of making a decision about all 3, there's the first question to ask yourself is, would they have gone forward and done all 3 components during this period? You may well also have learners who've already banked one or other of these components before March, in which case obviously those, if they've been achieved, stand. If those attempts are there but they weren't successful, would they have gone forward and resat during this period, or would they have been sitting after the end of July? And similarly, so it is really about trying to sort of frame all of this about what would have happened during that March to July period in normal circumstances. And clearly, what often happens with English is not all 3 components are necessarily done at the same time. So there is a would they have done all 3 components in the time to ask yourself, but then also a decision when you do decide which of those are in scope, a yes/no decision about each of those based on the evidence you've got.
So again, I've managed to leapfrog questions because I'm really good at that. So question 3 says, I have audio and video evidence. Do I need to write up the paperwork? What we're saying is that it's not a requirement to type up the paperwork or write up the speaking and listening official paperwork, but it's a very useful basis on which to record your thinking about the result. We've talked to the EQAs about this and they are aware. Obviously they would like nice neat paperwork, but I think because these are not formal assessments that are taking place, you're making a judgment based on the evidence that you have.
We're also, I think, very mindful that you've probably got quite a few of these to do and not a lot of time to do it. So don't easy for me to sit here and say don't sweat about it, but we're realistic about what you can do in the time as well. I think it's probably a fair way of putting it.
I see people are asking questions about if a learner achieves all 3 components of the English, will the full qualification need to be claimed? That sort of will depend a little bit on whether it's a legacy functional skills qualification or a reformed, because for the reformed, once you have all 3 components as a pass, then the certificate is the full award is made, whereas for the legacy there is a code to submit to draw the 3 elements together. Now I can see more questions about speaking and listening popping in, so some of these need to be taken a bit offline and some sort of clear responses added, and then again we can add those to the FAQs.
I think probably worth saying that the FAQs document is going to be a painting the fourth bridge a little bit, in the sense that I think we are going to keep there'll be a new incarnation of it landing in the next I was going to say in the next few hours, certainly in the next 24 hours, but I'm sure that we will keep adding to it as more things emerge, or if there are other things that we can perhaps frame in a different way. So yeah, I mean, I think certainly do keep the questions coming, because that's helpful to us, but also what we probably will need to say also is have a look at what's there already as well, and see if it has been addressed. Should we move on to another topic?
Well, can I just pick one up? That so somebody's just asked for clarification about the question 8 here. Is we're not looking for learners to have completed all of the activities, the 3 activities. So particularly for presentations, it may be necessary to draw on the experience of the learner outside of the functional skills lessons and work with other tutors if that's at all possible.
Back to that whole what if premise, aren't we? That there, in the sense of normal circumstances, you would have got all 3 activities done, you'd have had the chance to assess them, you'd have had a chance to write up the paperwork all nicely, but actually in the absence of that, what is a fair outcome?
Yeah.
Should we move on and talk about this submission process?
Yeah.
Okay, a few topics that have kind of emerged. The first one was, where do we find the guidance? The second one obviously is a deadline, and the third one, I guess, about the timescales itself. So to answer the first question, it's on the COVID-19 microsite. I was going to say I forgot the exact URL to find, but you can certainly follow the link from that. Probably worth saying that there is a generic centre guidance document that's not specific to functional skills. It kind of covers the whole centre assessment grading process, and that obviously talks about the actual process itself. There is then a declaration form, and we've done those sort of by category of qualification. So there is a functional skills specific one, just as there are separate declaration forms for ESOL, for both varieties of essential skills, and then also for a few other areas as well. You only submit one declaration form for your submission as a whole, so you haven't got to fill out a form for each candidate. I've had a couple of people ask me that in the last few days, and you can see the sort of the relief that lands on their face when I kind of say, no, it is the form's only got to be submitted once. So it is really a cover. Effectively, the form is a cover sheet for what you're putting on to the walled garden. The second question, I guess. And I guess that's the other crucial point, in the sense that the actual submissions themselves, the actual results that you're entering for individual learners, that's done directly onto the walled garden using the centre assessment grading tool. But the guidance document actually is quite detailed. It does take you through that process quite
some useful screenshots actually, because both Paul and I came back from furlough at the beginning of last week, so we weren't involved in the development of that. And I don't know about you, Paul, but actually reading that process and looking at those screenshots was quite explanatory. It's
actually, yeah. I mean, I don't want to big up colleagues too much, but I actually think I did a reasonably good job in terms of actually putting that. I know they put it together very quickly, but also making that fairly intuitive. So that side of it, I know we did say, I think last week, that the actual CAG tool on the walled garden wasn't up and running. It is now, as of this week, up and running. So that is now actually available and able to be used. I guess the next question was the deadline, and that's actually common across. I was going to say it's common across all qualifications. The one exception is Essential Skills Northern Ireland, that has a slightly earlier submission, and that was for regulatory reasons. But for everything, pretty much from most things, well, everything apart from Essential Skills, the deadline is Friday the 26th of June. That was sort of about as late as we could get it as far as convincing regulators of an appropriate date, given that one of the things that we have to do, obviously, once we get all of that information, is review it and then ultimately issue the results at the end. So it is, I think we're very conscious it is quite a tight timescale for everybody, but it was kind of about as late as we could possibly, we could realistically get it. And I guess that leads on to the other question 4, which was about can we do this in stages? And the answer, unfortunately, is no, in the sense that it is one submission covering everybody in this March to July bucket. So it is, you make one submission on behalf of everybody. You can put the individual results onto the walled garden, and I think you could do that bit incrementally, but you can't actually hit the button to submit until everything is in place.
It's worth saying the declaration, there's one declaration per qualification. So all the functional skills qualifications at your centre will be on one declaration. And the submissions and the declaration are per centre number. So for those as our customers who have more than one centre number, they will probably be able to find their information under their own centre number.
But it's, yeah, I mean, it is one form covering all 3 functional skills, and one form covering both legacy and reform. So the form is really for the category of qualification. So it's not for individual levels or any of the like. It's effectively a cover sheet for your whole functional skills submission.
It's worth saying that when you draw down the list, so when you go on to walled garden to make the submission, you will be supplied with a list of learners. And because this is being done particularly for English at component level, you will only see a list of learners for whom we haven't already got a pass or an achievement for a component. So if the learner has already achieved their reading at level 1, for example, they won't appear on the reading list.
Because, yeah, they've already got it, so we don't need you to submit for it.
Yeah.
In essence.
And yeah. I'm being asked lots of questions about the centre declaration. I'm just scanning it now to make sure that I've understood. But actually what it says is, please record the functional skills qualification this declaration corresponds to, and then it's the 6-digit programme of study number. So it would be 474801 for entry level English, 02 for level 1 and level 2 English, 03 for entry level maths, and 04 for level 1 and level 2 maths. So all subjects and levels are on one form, just to reiterate that.
Yeah, and it's effectively tick each that apply, basically, in the sense that if you're submitting a mixture of legacy and reformed, you need to obviously put the relevant 3748 numbers in as well. But it's basically each number under which you're making, and it goes back to what number learners were registered under. So obviously, if you've got learners who have a registration for legacy maths, for sake of argument, 374802 would need to be on that form. If you've got learners doing current maths at level 1, level 2, you would need 474804 to be included on that form. And the form, probably the best way to think of it, I think I mentioned that a second ago, is to treat it as effectively a cover sheet for your submission as a whole. So it obviously needs to clarify what's in scope in terms of what was in your submission. So obviously all of the qualification numbers that are applicable need to be on there. The forms of evidence you reviewed as a whole, it asks you to obviously tick each of the ones that are applicable. But again, obviously it's not physically asking you to submit anything.
It's probably worth saying that when you come to submit your centre assessed grades, for the externally set and marked components, so this is reading, writing and mathematics at level 1 and level 2, you have 3 options for a submission. You have a pass or a fail, or where you don't have sufficient evidence or you're not planning to submit a centre assessed grade, there's a no submission option. For everything else, so that's all entry levels and speaking and listening, you actually only put in the passes. So we're not asking you to claim the fails for entry level or speaking listening, because you wouldn't normally do that when you made claims through Walled Garden. Does that make sense, Paul? Have I said that clearly?
It is, yeah. I mean, the crucial point is that fails, and it's back to what I was saying a little bit earlier ago in the sense that a fail is not the same as a no submission, in the sense that a fail is I've reviewed the evidence and I've made a judgment that they wouldn't have achieved. And in the case of the external assessments, obviously we would normally know about those learners because they will have been entered. We will have marked their assessments and issued them with a fail grade. So what we're trying to do really effectively is mirror that process, in the sense that you are submitting a yes, they would have gone forward for assessment, yes, I've reviewed the evidence, but my conclusion is they would have failed. And that's useful for us because one of the things that we will be doing as part of reviewing that process is looking at your not wholly basing the judgments on it, but looking at obviously what your track record was as a centre in terms of pass rates for the external assessments, and looking at that alongside other things. So in that sense, it's helpful for us to know the proportion of learners going forward for passes versus fails. So that's what, in essence, is why we're asking you to submit fails only for those externally assessed components. So only for reading, writing, and for maths at level 1 and level 2. For all of the internal components, you're only submitting a grade if your conclusion is that they would have passed. If your conclusion is that they wouldn't have been successful, or indeed if your conclusion is that they wouldn't have gone forward under this process, then that's a non-submission. It's only the pass grades that we're actually collecting from you or collecting in terms of needing to be recorded as pass. There's no mechanism for reporting a fail for those components.
So the question 6, I don't know whether I've dreamt about now. Sorry, everybody. I'm looking at the question box and it's just like constantly moving, so it's a bit distracting. I keep being drawn into that. So learners were expected to sit some English exams assessments in June and July and the rest in September. What do I do? Well, you would submit the result, the centre assessed grade for those elements that were intended to be sat during June and July, and then for the elements that you are expecting them to complete normally, you just put no submission for that bit.
I think there are two things to that question, because I guess what was kind of to some extent behind that question was, can we still do the exams in June and July? And the answer to that, I think we've kind of clarified that is that the government and regulators' expectations were that everybody going forward for assessment between that March and July window are expected to go down the calculated result group. So we've actually closed off the ability to book the normal tests until the beginning of August. So anybody due to sit an exam assessment before the end of July would be in scope as far as this process is concerned. But yeah, if you've got if you're planning or you were working on the assumption that they wouldn't have done one of the components of English until September, then that's outside this process, and you would just wait till September and do that as you were planning to do.
It's probably worth saying that this approach was planned to cover everybody, so all types of provision. So I'm thinking about our colleagues who are delivering in the secure state and perhaps for the MOD. However, there is further discussions happening for those centres who use our pre-supply model. So there is a slightly different approach taking that. I've just seen a couple of questions coming into the question box about that.
Yeah. I mean, I think it is worth bearing in mind that I mean, to some extent, this was sort of done can't say dumb to us are the wrong words, but it was kind of what was framed, the process was framed around was that when the sort of statement came out from, and it came directly from Gavin Williamson just before Easter, about the sort of process as it would apply, the message from government was very clear that they expected everybody to be covered by it. Now, we've obviously looked at where there are particular providers with very particular operational reasons why that's not feasible, and there may well be discussions that take place around those. But the presumption, as far as kind of pretty much nearly all situations are concerned, is that the assumption is that if you were due to sit an assessment during this March to July period, that instead of that assessment happening, that this centre assessment grading process happens in its place.
So just to reiterate, so I've been asked again, if a test has been booked for a learner with plans to sit it in the workplace, the direction of travel is no, all learners will receive a centre assessed grade. And it's probably worth just clarifying, I'm sure we've done it earlier, but I'm getting questions about which learners would be eligible for this process. So this process is designed for learners who would have sat their assessments during the period 20th of March to the 31st of July. So it might be that your learners started on programme after the 20th of March, but are intended to complete before the 31st of July, and they will still fall within this. So it isn't so much when they were registered that's important, it's when they were planned to take their assessments.
And it's worth bearing in mind that the registration for functional skills, you register a learner for functional skills, that registration is actually valid for up to 3 years. So there will be plenty of learners who started on this, and your intention was never that they would go forward for assessment during that March to July window, in which case they're outside that process, and you say you carry on doing what you plan to do. If the intention was only that they would go forward for assessment after July, then they're outside. Ignore them as far as this process is concerned. They just go forward and do their assessments when you plan to do them. It's really just homing in on those particular learners, regardless of when they started. If they were intended to do their assessments during that period since lockdown happened and up until the end of July, then they're able to get a qualification through this process.
I'm just going to interrupt you because we're about to run out of time. There are two things that I just wanted to say. The first is, oh, I've lost it because it whizzed past me. So what happens if face-to-face learning doesn't return by the 1st of August? If I had a crystal ball and £1 million, I would like to be able to answer that question. This process has changed on a daily basis or even an hourly basis. So I'm not, and nobody is in a position to predict what's going to happen on the 1st of August. At the moment, the intention is that we will return to delivering assessments and exams as normal from the 1st of August. But please keep your eye on the website and on your inbox to make sure you're signed up for updates, because anything could happen in the next half an hour. Or beyond.
Well, not quite half hour, but I think you get it.
Sorry, that was my. Oh, sorry.
It's Hilary here. I'm the secret machine answering the questions in the background. So I just wanted to say, for any I haven't been able to answer that are in the list, I've been sending private responses as we've gone along. I will try to get back to you individually with answers to those questions. I think I've got to the bottom nearly. Well so just to let you know and say thank you for sending them through.
We will review this recording to see if it's useful. The problem with this style of webinar is that it's quite disjointed to listen to. So we will only post this recording if it is actually useful to listen to. In the meantime, as Hilary says, what we're doing is responding to these points, and we will update the FAQs again. So
also, yeah, I was going to say, also worth saying, we are back again next week. So we're going to say do all this all over again, we'll do a different, no doubt, a different set of questions that will emerge. And I think I said earlier on, one of the things that I think we're conscious of is that your questions will evolve the more that you engage with this process, and the more that you start to work through things, and that things will occur to you, no doubt, as you do that. So we're providing another opportunity to do that. We then have the regular June webinar scheduled for the following week, and I suspect, given that this process will still be in play at that point, I'm sure this will crop up as part of that as well. So yeah, do keep sending us questions. Everything we're getting, we're either answering directly, or we're adding to the FAQs, or we're reflecting in updated versions of the guidance. So all questions are useful in that sense. So it's all helpful. I guess we will say, as always, stay safe in this. I think I will also, probably worth saying, kind of do the best you can in the circumstances, because I think we are, I mean, I've talked to one or two people in the last few days who've been incredibly worried about this process, incredibly kind of concerned about getting it right, and that's absolutely fine. But I think it's also about we're working from the basis of doing what you reasonably can in the circumstances, and that's always going to be the way in which we approach this in terms of looking at this. I don't know if that helps in terms of reassurance, but it is about trying to make the best judgments you can in the situation.
Yeah.
Any final thoughts from my colleagues before we close?
No, I just want to say, look after yourselves, keep safe, and look forward to hearing your questions next week.
I will just leave this open for a second, just in case you're still typing in a question before so you don't get immediately cut off. But we will, I think at this point, probably say thank you and goodbye.
Thank you. I'll put myself on mute because we're now hammering upstairs in the bathroom. So thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Okay.